This next position was played in Las Vegas in 1998 in the National Open against an Armenian grandmaster named Laputian. He's a very strong player and excellent endgame player. Check out the position on the board. I had the black pieces, he was white, and he played rook f4. Now I was probably slightly better because I have a good central pass pawn. My king is a little more active than his. I want to come down to f3 with my rook. A critical theme in the endgames is the active king, as you guys have already seen from the earlier games. Now the question, similar to the last game, evaluate the king and pawn endgame. Should I trade or not? It's very important to be careful in assessing positions where your opponent offers you a trade into a king and pawn endgame, because chess and endgames, middle games, is very complex. There's a lot of imperfection in the game. But king and pawn endgames can be precise. There can be exact evaluations that are important to understand precisely. In this position, he played rook f4, and I have to decide, do I want to play king and pawn endgame, or do I want to play a move like rook c6 or rook g6, maintain the tension? So what you have to do now is you have to do a long calculation, which is a large part of king and pawn play. Take a few moments and calculate. After rook takes f4, g takes f4. I should probably play the move king d4 to gain space. Take it from there. This is a very deep calculation, so take your time. Don't rush. What do you think I did? An interesting psychological aspect of the situation is that when a strong player, a guy you really respect, offers you a trade, he's giving you his own judgment of the position. He's saying, I believe that this is good for me. A lot of chess players will trust the judgments of other players. If a grandmaster offers a king and pawn endgame, they'll think it must be losing, it must be good for them, so they won't go into it. But it's tremendously important to always trust yourself in chess. You're the only thing you've got. Gotta believe in your own calculation. Here I went into a deep think and figured out that I was winning. What can white do? If my opponent were to push his passed pawn with f5, I would simply go back, king e5, followed by taking the pawn. I'd be up a pawn. That'd be a big mistake. If my opponent moves his king, something like king d2, then I'll just play e3 check, king e2, king e4. I'm threatening the pawn. It's a good position for me. My opponent has to wait, and he has one good waiting move. He played the move h5. Now, if I were to go back with my king, say king d5, then suddenly I'd be losing. After king e3, my king has no moves to maintain the defense of the e4 pawn. I'll be in big trouble. I played the move e3. This was still part of the calculation. Here he played f5. Did he have any options? If he were to play king f3, then after king d3, my king is escorting my pawn down, I'll make a queen and win. If he moves his king backwards, say king e1, then I can easily move over king e4, followed by king takes f4, win the pawn, and I'll have a winning game. His only option was f5, king e5, king takes e3, king takes f5. And it's from here that I intended for your calculation to begin. That first problem I asked wasn't so easy. You reach this position, now it's important to evaluate it. A lot of the time when you reach an endgame, you're tired. You've been competing for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. You're exhausted. You don't want to think anymore. Your brain hurts. It's these moments that you have to suck it up. You have to give it everything you've got. My opponent probably offered the exchange without entering the position as deeply as he could have. I calculated very precisely. I used that last amount of energy I had and went deeper into this position. Now, there are two ways for it to go. It's either going to be a race, my king going to the king side, his king going to the queen side, or he can try to defend his own king side. Let's look at the two options. If he were to play a move like king f3, then I could just play king g5 and take the pawn. He obviously can't defend it. What he can try to do is pin my king to the side of the board. King e4, king takes h5, king f5. Does this work? At first glance, you may think that this would be a draw. King h4, king f4, king h3, king f3, king h4, king f4. White can follow the black king, keep him pinned to the back. But here I can force him into zugzwang. I can create a position where any move that he makes proves fatal. h5. Now, if white could stall, if white could not move, the game would be a draw. But that's not the case. If white plays the move a4, the only legal pawn move, I just take it and make a queen. If white plays king f5, I play king g3. My pawn goes to the board. And if white plays king f3, I just play king g5. Now, you recall when we looked at the king and pawn endgames that all white has to do to stop the rook pawn is occupy the corner. Yes, but here I don't worry about that. I bring my king to the queen side, king f5, king e5, king d5. I leave him to worry about the h-pawn. The white king can't follow my king because then I'll make a queen on the king side. And if he defends with king g3, I'll just bring my king around, take the a and b pawns, and make queens over there. The white king can't defend on both sides. So now we see what the calculation was all about. It was a race. After king takes f5, he played king d4. So now, if when I asked you the original position, you would reach this in your calculation and you had gone further, fantastic. Keep on going, check your calculation. If you didn't reach this point or didn't think you had to look this far, stop now. Calculate it out and tell me what the evaluation is. What do you think? So now the race went on. It was very important for me to calculate this whole thing out when I accepted the exchange of rooks, as I did. I played king g5, king c5. There's not much choice here. King takes h5, king b6. Now I move my king back, king g6. King takes a6. Have you calculated it out yet? h5. And here my opponent has three ways to try to make a queen. One is to take the pawn on b5 and push his a pawn. One is to take on b5 and then move his king and push the b pawn. And the third is to push his a pawn, and I take and try to queen the b pawn. The third example loses very quickly. After a4, b takes a4, b5. It looks like we're both queening at the same time, but the critical difference is that I'm queening with check. After a3, b6, a2, b7, I make a queen with check. The king has to move, and I can even sacrifice my queen for the b pawn and then queen my a pawn, and I win easily. After h5, he played king takes b5. Of course, I pushed again. Now he chose to move the b pawn. He played king a6, h3, b5, h2, b6, h1, I made a queen, and he played b7. What is the evaluation of this position? This is a very crucial aspect of king and pawn endgames, because a lot of the time one guy will make a queen before the other guy, and you have to know how to evaluate it. Just like critical squares, if you know the theory, then you can evaluate way ahead. But imagine if in the very, very first position of this whole calculation, when he played rook f4, if when I was calculating whether or not to play rook takes f4, g takes f4, and I had done this long 14-move calculation and reached this position, if I'd come to this final place and not known what the evaluation was, it looks dangerous, of course. His pawn is on b7. It's very important to know the basic chess theory in the endgame, and from there you can easily go on to make good decisions. This position is winning, and now we're going to look at why. I played queen c6 check. He played king a7, and I played queen c5 check, and he resigned. So now we're going to talk about why I'm winning. There are some basic rules that can help you through king and queen against king and pawn endgames. Let's take away as first I'll tell you the evaluation. If the pawn is on the 6th rank or before, it's an easy win, always. We'll only talk about the pawn being on the 7th rank. If you have the king and queen, you're always winning against a knight pawn, a queen pawn, a king pawn, or the other knight pawn. No matter how far away your king is, no matter how close his king is to his own pawn. But a rook pawn on the 7th or a bishop pawn on the 7th is a draw. Why? Let's take a look at the knight pawn first. Start from this position. The key is to bring your king to the defense of the pawn and to stop him from queening in the meantime. How do you do that? You begin by checking him. The king has to move. Now you stop the pawn and threaten it. The king has to defend. Now you check him. The only move white has is to go in front of his pawn. You've gained a tempo. You bring your king in. Okay, white moves the king. You bring your queen down. You pin the pawn. White has two answers. If he allows you to, you immediately blockade the pawn. Then it's over. Your king can just come to defense and you win the pawn easily. He goes to the corner, then you check him again. Once again, white is forced in front of his pawn. You've gained another tempo. The king comes one step closer. White tries to go the other way. You check him. We know what you do if he goes in front of the pawn, so say he goes over. You stop the pawn from going. He defends, you check him again. He's forced once more in front of his pawn. Your king comes one step closer. We're noticing a pattern here. The white king moves, you pin him. He moves again, you check him. He moves again. What is your best move here? Be careful. You don't want to draw when the win is so close. Imagine how terrible you would feel if you played King d7 or King d8 and your opponent looked at you and said, stalemate, it's over. When the victory is as close as it can get, you can still throw it away. Always be careful. The correct move is just King d6, and then after you play King c8, Queen c7 is checkmate. No problem. So the technique, and you can figure this out logically, you don't have to memorize the moves. The technique is to keep on checking him or pinning him, force the king in front of the pawn, and then bring your king one step closer. The technique is exactly the same for d or e pawns. Just to look quickly, if the pawn was on d7, you could check him. The king moves, you force him in front, you bring your king closer, he moves, you pin him, check him. It's a normal pattern. You force the king in front again. Notice again, I didn't stalemate him. This would be stalemate. Be careful. He moves, and now, of course, white has no threat. He can't queen because he's pinned. You just bring the king over. The king has to go this way because this would be checkmate. King moves away, and you take the pawn, and mate quickly follows. Now, why do you think it is that a bishop pawn is drawing? This is one of the interesting paradoxes of chess. If you have a queen against the bishop pawn, there's no way to stop him from pushing the pawn without stalemating him. Why? Let's take a look. You check him like you always do. He moves away. He's threatening the queen. You check him again. He moves away. You check him again. Okay, he moves. You stop him from queening. He defends his pawn. And now when we reach the critical moment, after you check him, notice in all other positions he was forced to defend his pawn from in front. But now the key difference is that he can go to the corner, still threatening the queen, and after you take it, it's stalemate. King is stuck in the corner. And this is why the theory of king and pawn against king and queen, the bishop pawn, is drawing. Now notice, of course, that if white were to have had an extra pawn on a2, then it would be winning. Because after you check him, if he goes to the corner, then you could take the pawn, because this pawn could move. So we're talking about only one pawn. Often it can be to the defender's disadvantage to have extra pawns on the board, because it gets in the way of stalemate. Why is the rook pawn drawn? That's a little more obvious. You check him, he moves, you try to defend, and then when you give him that final check to try to force him in front of the pawn, he just goes there. You don't have the time to bring your king in, because that would be stalemate once more. So now we see the theory of king and queen against king and pawn. Let's return to that final position I had against Laputian. After I played queen c5 check, he resigned. Why? Because it's a knight pawn, first of all, so we know I'm winning. So when he moves in front of his b pawn, if I want to, I can just take his a pawn. Although there's no need, I can just bring my king. As a final review, if you have a king and queen against a king and pawn, this position is drawn, the rook pawn. This position is winning, because you can force the king over. This position, once more, is drawn. The black king can't come closer, because in the critical moment, the king can move to the corner, and you can't take the pawn because of stalemate. This position, once more, is winning. You force the king in front of the pawn. Similarly, this position is winning. You can force the king in front of the pawn, step by step, bring your king closer. The bishop pawn, the same on either side, drawn. The king can go to the corner. The rook pawn, also drawn. The king can go to the corner. You can't make any progress. And that's the theory of king and queen against king and pawn. Keep that in mind in your calculations. Now that you know the basic rules of king and queen against king and pawn, I have to tell you a couple exceptions to keep your eye out for. First of all, a lot of the time these endgames come about when there are races and one side queen's right before the other one. For example, if it's black to move here, h4, a5, h3, a6, h2, a7. Now black queen's right before white defends the queening square, and it seems like, yes, it's a rook pawn and so it should be a draw because of what I just told you. But this position is winning for black. If the queen can ever occupy the queening square, it's over. Winning. The only way this would be a draw is if the white king could come to b8. This is a draw. But in this position, after queen a8, it's all over. The king defends, and step by step, the black king comes in, forces the king back. You take the pawn, and you win the game. The exact same thing can be said about bishop pawns. This position, white to move, is winning for black. King b6, queen c8, over. You occupy it, the king comes in. But after king b7, now this is a draw because of the stalemate that we saw. Always look out for the exceptions. Don't just be dogmatic when you know a rule. Know the principles, and then check it for yourself. There are a lot of exceptions in chess.